Well, hello everyone. It's great to be back with you again this week. Elaine and I were on vacation last week. We were able to watch online, had a nice restful week, but we missed you guys. And so it's really good to be back and really exciting to be here in the yoga studio again. It's really nice to be back. I don't think I've been here since like early November. So this is really, really exciting. You know, something interesting about me, just a random fact for you, is that some of my favorite movies in the world are the Lord of the Rings movies. I absolutely love them. I love the story. It's just such a great adventure story. These three books. It's the story of good versus evil. We've got the fate of the world in the balance, and you know, I really love the books. I'm sure people could debate for quite a while on whether books or movies are better. And I really enjoy the books. But I think the movies do such an amazing job of really capturing the epic scale of that story and just everything that's going on. I think they really immerse you in the world that Tolkien created with these stories. But as much as I love these movies, there's one complaint, one thing that I hear very often from people who aren't as fond of them. And I'm willing to bet of those of you who've seen them who are here, probably some of you may share this opinion. And that's that from people who don't enjoy them as much, one of the reasons they give is that they feel like these movies are just 90% just shots of walking, just going from point A to point B without a whole lot going on in between. And to be fair, that's not an entirely incorrect statement. Like these are long movies. There's a lot of walking in them. I think the longer version of the third one is something like close to 5 hours long. So they are long movies, and they can be tough to get through. I still love them, but there's a lot of people who think that they're just too slow, that all of these shots of like walking and talking just kind of slow down the movies too much. They sort of take away from that feeling of wonder or adventure, and they just kind of leave them feeling boring. And so people struggle to get through them, because that's not really how we think about these big, grand adventures like that. You know, we're used to stories that are a lot more fast-paced, that really quickly move from point to point to point. They're full of these really high moments and these really low moments, but we don't give so much focus to those moments in between. And when it comes to movies and books today, those in-between times, those are the ones that often just kind of get rushed past or cut out altogether, because they just slow things down too much. And we get bored of just watching all of the walking. And I think as we've looked at the Psalms of Ascent and sort of how they describe our journey through life, we've spent a lot of time looking at those really fast-paced moments. You know, where we find God in those extremes of life, those times where we're experiencing just incredible victory, and we're so thankful to God for what he's done, kind of on a high mountaintop kind of moment. Or on the other end, those times of like really incredible struggle, where we're sort of in the midst of the valleys or really difficult times in life, and we're crying out to God for help. You know, we've looked a lot at those dramatic ups and downs that life takes us through. But I think a question that we need to ask as we're thinking about this journey that we're on is, what about those in-between moments? Those moments in our journey where we're just kind of walking. You know, we've talked so much about those extremes, but not every day and not every moment that we experience is one of those extreme moments. And so where is God in our everyday life? Where's God in those normal days? We're just walking through life. It's business as usual, just another run-of-the-mill day. And I really think it's important for us to really think about that question, because we're really quick to look to God in those really exciting moments of victory and thank him for what he's doing. We're really quick to look to God when we need help and we're experiencing the really difficult times. But I find it's in those in-between moments when we're just kind of going through the regular routine of life, just kind of doing our thing. Those are the times that we struggle more often than not to really think about, where is God in my life in this moment? And so that's exactly what I think Psalm 127 is really talking about. And this psalm, it's a little bit different from some of the psalms that we've looked at up to this point. It's got a little bit of a different tone to it. And that's because this is labeled as a song of ascent of Solomon. We've had a song of ascent of David a couple of weeks ago. This is a song of ascent of Solomon, his son. And you can see his fingerprint as an author all the way through this song. When you look at it, there's a lot of similarities between this psalm and a lot of the other things that Solomon's written. Specifically, there's a lot of common themes and ideas here to what you would find in a book like Ecclesiastes that we looked at as a church last year. And what this psalm does is really, it slows down the pace and it really zooms in on two different areas of life, and showing why it's so important to remember God in those everyday moments and those everyday areas of our life, showing really where God is and why that matters for our everyday life. The first area that it focuses on is in verse 1 and 2, and that's our everyday work. And it's showing that God's presence in our everyday life changes the way that we view our work. And verse 1 sort of begins to introduce that idea, talking about two different jobs, both a builder and a watchman. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. And unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And so this verse, it introduces us to this psalm with kind of a familiar idea that we've seen before in some of these Psalms of Ascent, specifically with similar language to what there is in a psalm like Psalm 124. Now that passage begins with saying, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, and then goes on to describe what would have happened. And now here we come to Psalm 127, and we open with these words, unless the Lord builds the house, and unless the Lord watches over the city. They both have this same idea of presenting us with a view of where we would be without God, where we would be if God's presence was not with us. While Psalm 124 is highlighting really God's presence with his people in a time of incredible and intense difficulty and struggle, this is a psalm that's really presenting our need for God's presence with us just in the midst of our everyday life, in the midst of our everyday work and routine. Because the reality is we have just as much desperate need for God's presence in our life, in those everyday moments, as we do in the moments where things are going off the rails or when we're on cloud nine. God's presence, it's not just needed in disasters or victories, but in our everyday life. I love that song that Miriam and Woody just sang that talks about, Lord, I need you every hour. I need you. And I think that's really what this psalm gets at. And again, verse 1 presents us with this picture of where we would be without God's presence with us. And really what it's telling us is that if God's not with us in our everyday work, then our everyday work is in vain. If God is not the one who's building the house, if God is not the one who's watching the city, then the builder builds in vain and the watchman stays awake in vain. Their work ultimately is going to amount to nothing. God's presence is needed for their everyday work to have any real lasting meaning or purpose. Because in the end, what is the point of our everyday work if we're viewing it as separated from our relationship with God, sort of compartmentalized over here? We've got God and he's sort of in charge of the spiritual matters of our life, but our everyday work and just sort of routine, that's kind of over here in its own category, doing its own thing. What is the actual point of our work if that is how we're viewing it? Well, verse 2 kind of continues and it broadens this point a little bit from these two specific examples and images to talking about work in a bit more broad terms. You know, getting up early, going to bed late, that whole daily routine, and struggling to find some kind of fulfillment in what it calls our anxious toil. And again, it gives us this picture of everyday life and everyday work outside of the context of a relationship with God, sort of answering that question of what does our work accomplish without him? And this is what it says. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. I mean, are you seeing the similarities to Ecclesiastes here in this verse? This is the third instance of having this word vanity in this passage. And this is the word that is so prominent throughout the entire book of Ecclesiastes. It's sort of the main theme, vanity of vanities, literally meaning a breath, here 1 minute, gone the next. It doesn't last. Well, that's such a common theme in really all of Solomon's writings, that we try so hard to find meaning and purpose in life and in work, but outside of God, really, it just can't happen. We can't do it. But as we look at that verse, specifically verse 2, doesn't that give us such a relatable view of what life can be like some days? You know, how many of us could say that we've had a day that could be summed up by that verse? It's in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. You know, I definitely feel like I have days like that where I just kind of fall into this rut or this routine. You get up in the morning, you go to work, you come home, you go to bed, and then you do it all again the next day. And it can feel so repetitive and start even just to feel really discouraging. You sort of start to ask yourself, what is the point of it all? What is it all for? What are you working for in the end? And I know that this is a struggle for a lot of people that I've talked to, that the pandemic has really sort of brought out in our lives. You know, that challenge of being motivated or finding purpose or meaning in work, when work just means getting out of bed and going to sit on your couch or going to sit at your kitchen table to do your work in the time when we've all been working from home. And the reality is that is the condition that so much of the world lives in. You know, working day in and day out, trying to provide for themselves, trying to find some sort of purpose, some sort of fulfillment in work. But ultimately, all of that hard work, it can never really give us what we want it to. It can never really fulfill us in the way that we want it to. Because without God, it will always end up being in vain, and we'll be left with nothing but, like it says, eating the bread of anxious toil. And these verses, they give us a really good picture of what everyday work is like outside of the context of a relationship with God, without God's presence in your work. But on the flip side of that, the question has to be asked, so then how does God's presence in your work change things? You know, how does it actually change the way that you work? Because like I said, we need God as desperately in those everyday moments and that everyday work as we do in the extremes of our life. But the reality is that viewing work in its proper context changes everything. Because you and I were always created to work. You know, that was always part of how God made us in the perfect world that God created in Genesis 1 and 2. Before the fall, before sin entered the world, Genesis 2:15 tells us that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And so God built work into his perfect creation. It was something that he always intended for mankind to work in this world. And that work didn't become difficult until after the fall, but the work itself was there from the very beginning. It's part of how we were created in the image of God. And later in the New Testament, in the book of Colossians, Paul comments more on how viewing our work in relation to God changes how we view our work. Specifically, Colossians 3:23, that says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men." And so again, he's encouraging believers to view their hard, everyday work in the context of their walk with God, working for him rather than for men, or rather than themselves. And I think that Josh Moody really sums it up really well in his book, Journey of Joy, when he comments on this psalm. And this is what he says about viewing our everyday work. He refers to it as the daily grind in the context of a loving relationship with God. He says, your work becomes a love for God who has given you this opportunity to love him back. As Paul says, you do it as for the Lord, not as for men, but as for the master. Everything is transformed by this perspective of being loved by God. And so viewing our life in the context of this relationship, it really does change everything. How we process the extremes of life as well as the everyday. It impacts everything. Without God, the builder builds in vain, and without God, the watchman stays awake in vain. But with God, the building has purpose. With God, the watching has purpose. And the end of verse 2 gives us this promise where it says, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Because God ultimately is our reward. He's the purpose behind our work. And he gives us such rest. He gives us rest from constantly trying to find fulfillment and purpose in that vain and anxious toil. Trying to find our fulfillment there in what will never and can never actually fulfill us the way that we want. Because in the end, all of our work will pass away. All of the money that we accumulate, that'll pass away. We can't take any of it with us. But God gives us rest in the knowledge that we are perfectly fulfilled by a loving relationship with our Creator. And that our everyday work can be seen as an expression of our love and worship to him. And so that's the first area that this psalm really focuses on, how God's presence in our life changes how we view our work. And then as we come to verse 3 to 5, we see the second area that this psalm focuses on. And at first glance, these verses, they almost feel kind of disconnected from each other. You know, if I were to tell you that these came from two completely different psalms and were just kind of put together, you probably wouldn't have too much difficulty believing that. But in reality, they are very closely related. Because once again, we're being shown how God's presence in our life transforms really a core and everyday element of our lives. Well, the first two verses are talking to us about how God's presence changes our work. Now, these last three verses change attention to looking at how God's presence changes how we view family. And look at what these three verses say. It says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies at the gate. And again, these verses are showing us how God's presence in our everyday life changes the way that we see our family. And doing that, it takes this position of a parent's perspective on their children. And look at the wording that he uses here to describe children. He says children are a heritage from the Lord. He says children are a reward. They're like an arrow in the hand of a warrior. It says, blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. Now, we live in a culture that I think really tends to downplay the importance and the value of family and of children. It's It just doesn't have that place of importance in our culture and our society that it once had. But look at the beautiful picture that's given in this passage for how God designed families to operate, how God designed families to look. He designed family to be such a gift and such a blessing. And he designed families to be something that would cause us to worship him. These aren't necessarily for a lot of us easy verses. Many of you may look at these verses and find that they don't quite feel as relatable as the first two. For one reason or another, maybe you're sitting here and your experience with family doesn't quite line up with what you see in these verses, either from the perspective of a parent or from the perspective of a child. But what this passage is giving us is really a picture into the perfect way that God designed families to be. How he designed the relationship between parents and children to look. Well, I'm sure there are many people who've had experiences with parents or experiences with children that don't, again, seem to quite measure up to that. That's because our families, just like everything else, they're affected by the sin and the brokenness of the world that we live in. You even look at Adam and Eve and their two sons, Cain and Abel. After Cain murdered his brother, I don't think these are the types of words that were the first ones coming to Adam and Eve's mind. I don't think this is the first kind of thing that they thought when they heard that news. Because family is such a gift from God, but family can be really hard and family can be really messy. But what we're given here in this passage is, again, how God designed family to look, and something that we can be praying for our families. I have a really good friend that I pray with regularly. Just about every week, if we can manage it, we'll call and pray together. And just a couple of weeks ago, he and his wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And this was so exciting. Also a little weird that people my age are starting to have kids. That was kind of a weird moment. But back when this friend first told me that they were pregnant, I remember the two of us, we celebrated together. And from that point forward, every time we would call and we would pray together, we would pray that this would be true of their family. We prayed that God would help this friend and his wife to be good parents, to raise their daughter well, to love the Lord. And we prayed that God would be with their daughter, working in her heart and eventually bringing her to himself. We prayed that God would be at the center of their family every single day and in every single aspect. And even now that their daughter's been born, every single week, that is a prayer that we're praying together. And I don't want you to misunderstand, praying these things for your family doesn't automatically mean that family is not a difficult thing. I can't stand up here and promise you that. But these verses are an encouragement to trust God with every day and every part of your family. As much as the first two verses gave us a picture of our work without God, these verses are giving us this picture of how God designed families to be. Or maybe you're in a different situation. Maybe you're sitting here and you've never had kids. Maybe that's something that just hasn't happened for you quite yet, or maybe that's something that has been unable to happen for some reason. But there is still so much truth to be found in these verses for people in every stage of life or in every situation. This is not just something that is written for parents. And I think one thing that you can be praying for is that you as a child would be living this out for your parents. That God would help you to be that kind of heritage and blessing and reward for your parents, and that he would use you as a blessing in their lives. Because even if not all of us are parents, we have parents. But I also want to read you a quote from Josh Moody's commentary on this passage, as he talks about another application of these verses for those who don't have any children of their own. And this is what he says: there are many examples in the Bible of the spiritual children that you can have. So Paul, for instance, was a father figure for Timothy. When you tell someone the gospel, you may have the privilege of seeing a new birth. And that can be just as much or even more of a blessing. You can invest in pastoral and discipleship work, ministry as heritage from God. And so God has provided a way for each and every one of us to live out the truth of these verses, no matter where we are in life. By sharing the gospel, by seeing people come to Christ, you then have the opportunity to invest in discipling them and teaching them as they grow in their walk with him. These verses tell us it's that family is a gift, but it's not always easy. But God's presence in our everyday lives changes the way that we view our families. As I end, one of the things that I read as I was preparing this week was a quote by Charles Spurgeon, as he was commenting not so much on this psalm specifically, but really all of the Psalms of Ascent up to this point. And he was looking at the opening verse of each of the Psalms of Ascent and looking how each one opens really with this tone of praise and focus on God. And Psalm 127 is no exception. And I really love what he said. It says this: the Lord and the Lord alone is praised at each step of these songs of ascent. And then he says, oh, for a life whose every step will suggest a new song to the Lord. Oh, for a life whose every step will suggest a new song to the Lord. I love that line so much. Again, Spurgeon's talking really about all of the Psalms of Ascent up to this point, not specifically Psalm 127, but I think that so beautifully captures the heart of Psalm 127. Oh, for a life where every little aspect of our everyday life is viewed in the context of our relationship with God and causes us to worship and to rely on him. Because the truth of the gospel, the truth of the love that God has shown to us through Christ, that gives new life and it gives new meaning to every aspect, every part of life. And it's not just meant for the extreme ups and downs of life, but it truly transforms how we view everything in our everyday lives. Little shout out to my wife. She's been doing a short podcast series with her home church in New Hamburg, and really the focus of everything that she talks about in that podcast is how the gospel really applies to your everyday life and how it impacts and changes your everyday life. And I know that I've enjoyed listening to those, and I've learned a lot through what she has said. But it's true, the truth of the gospel impacts and changes every element of your life. And, that's my prayer for myself, as well as my prayer for us as a church, that we would be people who live our lives in such a way that every step of life will suggest a new song of praise to the Lord. That our relationship with God would be the essential foundation for our entire lives and impact every aspect of it. And that we would rely on God for help and give him glory in even the smallest elements of our everyday lives. Because at the end of the day, focusing on God's presence in our everyday life transforms the way that we view every part of our lives and causes us to worship him. And Father, we thank you so much for your presence with us. And Lord, I pray that this would be true of us, that God, every step of our life would be seen as a new opportunity to praise you, that in every moment of our everyday life, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, we will always be thinking about where you are with us in our everyday life. And God, how our life, how our work, how our families can be used to praise and to glorify you. Lord, I thank you so much for just the chance to come together today and to meet as a church to worship and to glorify you on this Sunday. And I pray that this would be something we would take into this week to think about how our everyday life can be used to glorify you. We pray this in your name. Amen.